in the chat box. So right now we'll be recording the presentation component of the meeting, but any items where there is any identifying information of participants in the presentation or question and answer segments or discussion will be removed from the recording. So we want you to feel as comfortable as possible with sharing your thoughts openly in this meeting with us. I know that most of us are very comfortable with Zoom, but just a little reminder, the chat box is at the bottom of your screen at the center view. You also have the raised hand function at the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen as well. And if you're joining us via the mobile phone, you can see both options, the raised hand and the chat box in the menu. So feel free to use those and other reactions which you would like in order to participate in this presentation. We will now be hearing from James Brandt from the Essex Region Conservation Authority.
Thanks, Faith. So first, I'd like to just welcome everyone for logging into this meeting tonight. It's a public information center that's specifically related to the Little River Watershed Floodplain Mapping Study, which is entangled with the larger overall Sandwich South Master Servicing Study. Just, before I continue on, if I lose my video, I may have to turn it off depending on how the bandwidth issues are on my end. So I may just bear with me. If you don't see me, I'm still here. So, and if anybody has any issues hearing me, please let me know. So as I mentioned, this is entangled with the Sandwich South Master Servicing Study, but we're focusing on the Little River Watershed Floodplain Mapping. A few weeks ago, the City of Windsor and Dillon Consulting, they focused more on that Master Servicing Study through a PIC that was held earlier. We have a few people here tonight that are key to this study. First, myself, I'm James Bryant, the Director of Watershed Management Services at the Essex Region Conservation Authority. We also have Mr. Ryan Langlois, the Water Resources Lead with Dillon Consulting. And we also have Mr. Patrick Winters, who's the overall project manager with the City of Windsor. So tonight, we're going to walk you through what regulatory flood maps are really and what that means with the Little River Watershed Floodplain Mapping Study. The presentation should be about an hour or so, with another hour available for some questions and feedback. As Faith mentioned, we want to keep this as interactive as possible. With that, though, we understand that there may be some questions that are property specific, but because of the size of the study and the scope and scale that we're dealing with here, we ask that if your question is site specific, that you contact the appropriate individual via the contact information that we'll be providing at the end of the presentation. If you have any other questions related to the slides or any other content, we're happy to do our best to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'll pass this over to Mr. Ryan Langlois at Dillon Consulting, and he'll start guiding us through some of those materials.
Perfect. Thanks for the introduction, James. So overall, good evening, stakeholders and residents of the City of Windsor. My name is Ryan Langlois, and I am the lead water resource engineer for the study on behalf of Dillon Consulting. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that this is the land and traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all the original people of Turtle Island, North America, who have been living and working on the land. So why are we here today? We're here because the project team will be going through a number of items through the evening, which will discuss the purpose of the Little River Watershed Regulatory Floodplain Mapping Update Study. We will be identifying the process of regulation floodplain mapping and the Essex Region Conservation Authority's role. We will be summarizing the work completed to date, the findings of the study, and the proposed two-zone approach to floodplain management for the area. We will also be available at the end of this presentation to answer any questions specifically relating to the regulated floodplain mapping and two-zone concept. There are representatives from the City of Windsor, IRCA, and Dillon Consulting in attendance, so please let us know if you have any questions. So what is the purpose of this study? To put it simply, the existing Little River drain floodplain maps are outdated and need to be brought up to current existing conditions. Additionally, a number of existing municipal drains throughout the upper reaches of the watershed currently do not have official regulated floodplain maps, which are important when future development comes forward to establish setback limits from drains and floodproofing requirements. Through another study being led by the City of Windsor and Dillon Consulting for the Sandwich South Master Planning area along the upper reaches of the watershed, the City of Windsor and IRCA both decided that it would be a good time to take a more holistic approach to floodplain mapping for the watershed. The overall purpose of the study is to develop updated hydrologic and hydraulic models for the municipal drains, update existing regulatory floodline maps for the Little River Drain, which was last updated in 1985, develop new floodline maps for existing municipal drains throughout the Little River watershed, determine the regulatory 1 in 100-year flood elevations, and identify updated floodproofing requirements for future developments. So the regulation floodplain mapping process. This process typically takes into consideration a number of guidelines that have been set forth within both provincial and federal floodplain mapping documents. This includes the technical guidelines shown here through the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, as well as the Ontario Conservation Authorities at the provincial level, and the Flood Mapping Guideline Series at the federal level through Natural Resources Canada. The overall floodplain mapping framework shown here consists of a number of components for flood mitigation studies, from flood hazard identification and flood level estimation to the completion of floodplain mapping, flood risk assessments, and flood mitigation. The framework illustrates the relationship between these different components and links them to the federal floodplain mapping guideline series documents. As part of this study, IRCA and the project team is taking the framework to the stage of flood mapping. The study modeling and results, however, can be used for future work for specific flood risk assessments and a review of flood mitigation strategies if needed in the future. I will now slide the presentation over to James Brandt at IRCA to discuss the Conservation Authority's responsibilities related to flooding risk.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'll start by just saying, there's 36 conservation authorities across the province of Ontario. And IRCA, like others, receive their authority through the Conservation Authorities Act and the cascading regulations. So while there's numerous functions and services at IRCA and other CAs that we deliver, one of the primary roles is specifically related to watershed management and natural hazards mitigation, focused around flooding and erosion. This protection is, delivered through working with municipalities within our region collectively. We implement relevant flood management policies, such as a 1 or a 2 zone policy, which is something we'll touch on a little bit later, but it's kind of highlighted on the slides there. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the concept of natural hazards mitigation and flood management. So how does that really connect with what we're talking about today? Generally, the CA works in parallel with municipal planning processes, whether it's large scale or small scale development. The authority reviews large-scale development in line with applicable planning process. You can see that with, in line with municipal plan review on the slide there. And we do that to ensure that all relevant hazards are addressed, specifically, most notably flooding and erosion. For smaller scale development, there's a few key elements to address, and that's typically done through something that we call a Section 28 permitting process that many may be familiar with. Similar to when you build a house within a regulated area, you may need a building permit, and in parallel with that, you may need something called an IRCA permit, which is a Section 28 permit issued by our office within our area through the Conservation Authorities Act. I think the biggest point on this slide is less about what we as IRCA do to help with the reduction of flood risk, but rather the block at the bottom of the slide. It says the municipality also has a huge role in flood protection by using its available tools like the Planning Act and provincial policy statement. So this includes using things like floodplain maps to identify hazard lands in official plans, as well as establishing policies on how best to handle these lands depending on the scope and scale of the hazard. So instruments that a municipality might use includes official plan amendments, zoning bylaw amendments, and I mentioned official plan updates in general. So the reality is IRCA and the municipalities actually work very closely together in achieving the objectives of flood risk reduction. Next slide, please. So the Conservation Authorities Act, it outlines many aspects, including governance structure of the overall objects of the authority. More importantly for this meeting, Section 28 of the Act provides the legislative framework for regulating developments including a broad explanation for where the Conservation Authority's regulatory jurisdiction is. So these are generally, they're listed on the slides 1 through 5. For the purpose of the current undertaking, we're dealing with the areas that are affected by flooding and those hazard lands associated with that particular natural hazard. The hydrologic and hydraulic modeling completed as part of this study defines the potential flood hazard limit, which informs the area that's subject to regulation, where development can occur, but also where it can't occur and where it can occur subject to specific conditions. Next slide, please, Ryan. So when we talk about regulating development, we're talking about development as it's defined by the Conservation Authorities Act. The definition of development is shown on the slide in point form there, and that's specifically right out of Section 28 of the Act, which states that construction, reconstruction, erection, or placing of a building or structure of any kind is development, as well as any changes to a building or structure that would have the effect of altering the potential use of the building or structure, increasing the size of the building, increasing the number of dwelling units, etc. Site grading, temporary, permanent placing, or basically just moving the fill from one place to another. So, carry on, you're good. So Section 28 of the Act, it empowers the conservation authorities to develop legislation or regulation under the parent CA Act, and that defines how Section 28 is to be implemented by a conservation authority. So in our case, we're dealing with Regulation 15806, which is regulation of development interference with wetlands and alterations to shorelines and watercourses. So as mentioned before, the regulation it's a permissive regulation. When I said development can occur with specific conditions, what that means is it's a permissive regulation. And therefore, development in a regulated area requires a permission from the conservation authority. And this is done by what most people refer to as a permit, as I mentioned before. So in issuing a permit, the authority has to confirm that the specific hazards are not negatively affected by the proposed development. As well, we have a responsibility to confirm that there is safe ingress and egress to and from the property during times of flooding. Staff use a series of tools that include, but they're not limited to, legislation, provincial guidance documents, and board-approved policies to review an application and make sure that, like I said, things are not negatively affecting the existing hazard. Next slide, please. So I previously just mentioned board-approved policy on that last slide, and that's what this slide is really diving into. So IRCA is governed by a board of directors, which is made up of appointed elected officials from each of the municipalities. The board approves policy, including specific policies on how the Conservation Authority and administration and staff review the applications that come into the office. How the review is integrated into various development processes, and how that kind of intertwines with the Planning Act. So a lot of applications will come in and we may review that under a Planning Act stream, or we may review that as a straight up Section 28 stream. But additionally, the board approves policies related to something we refer to as a 1-zone or a 2-zone policy. There's more on this to come, but to generalize it, a 1-zone policy would prohibit development within a flood zone. A 2-zone policy would permit development within the shallow, slow-moving area of a flood zone, provided that specific conditions are met. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a high-level flow chart of the steps we've taken so far with respect to the modeling, resulting in the 2-zone policy framework. And I'll actually, I'll let Ryan jump back in here and take us through this in a bit more detail with everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, James. So as you can see here, the project team has completed a substantial amount of work to get to where we are at today. Floodplain mapping is not simple, and it requires the use of complex technical analysis and modeling to accurately assess, to the best of our abilities, open channel flooding due to rainfall in the region. Through this presentation, I will be providing you with a brief summary of the technical process, or primarily focusing on the results coming out of the study. The process for the study included consultation with Dillon Consulting, IRCA, as well as the third-party reviewer, which was represented by a senior member of the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority. The technical approach for the study was agreed upon at the early stages of the project, and the hydraulic and hydrologic modeling was then completed. Coming out of the technical analysis was the recommendation of a two-zone floodplain concept. This concept is widely used in areas across Ontario and has been unofficially used throughout the Windsor-Essex region for quite some time now. Through the acceptance of a two-zone concept for the Little River watershed, the regulatory floodplain mapping update for the Little River and new floodplain maps for the other municipal drains throughout the watershed were developed. Which brings us to where we are at today, stakeholder engagement. Following this public information session, the final reports, floodplain maps, and draft regulation policy update will be brought to the IRCA board for final approval. Once the board has approved the integrated two-zone concept into policy for the region, it will be then brought to the municipality level for approval. The technical component of the study include the development of analysis of both a calibrated hydrologic and hydraulic model for the watershed. The hydraulic model took into consideration both in-drain cross-sections and structures such as culverts and bridges and natural floodplain areas outside of the banks of the municipal drains. Due to the flat terrain in our region, the use of a two-dimensional surface using provincial topographic mapping was used to represent the potential floodplain areas outside of the banks of the drain to get an accurate account of flooding areas. This integrated 1D, 2D approach to floodplain modeling provides for a better representation of the floodplain extents and representation of complex flow conditions between adjacent drainage features during larger storm events. The overall findings from the study identified that the technical modeling representation of municipal drains and potential overbank flood areas provided the team with a better assessment of flood depths and spread. This also allowed for a robust but realistic basis to determine floodproofing requirements for future development. Based on the findings of the study, it was identified and determined that the 1 in 100 year 24-hour event would be maintained as the region's regulatory storm event to determine flood lines. Due to the flat terrain of the region, it was also recommended that the Little River watershed be considered as a two-zone area to approach floodplain management and overall flood hazard limits. The recommended two-zone approach to floodplain management considers the following zones: a primary floodway and a secondary flood fringe area. In the past, the typical standard for floodplain management has always been a one-size-fits-all, one-zone concept, representing the overall flood hazard set by the region's regulatory flood standard storms, such as the 1 in 100 year. This would then rely on conservation authorities to determine the extent of setback needed from a theoretical floodplain for future development. This also made the decision-making process for floodproofing requirements for future development somewhat difficult, especially in areas where no floodplain mapping was completed. Through this two-zone concept, the two zones would be categorized in different manners based on a set of technical standards that is spelled out in both provincial and federal floodplain mapping guidelines. The floodway area is the hazardous portion of the floodplain where flood depths and/or velocities are such that they pose a significant threat to life and/or property. The floodway is generally defined as the area required for the safe passage of flood flows. The flood fringe area is the portion of the floodplain between the outer limits of the floodway and the regulatory floodline limit. Flood depths and velocities are generally less severe in the flood fringe, and some development may be permitted, as James identified, with conditions. When developing floodproofing standards within the flood hazard limit, both zones must be considered. The floodway area is primarily contained within the municipal drain banks throughout this watershed. Development is prohibited, and the floodway shall remain unobstructed and without any placed fill. The flood fringe area is considered to be outside of the floodway, but still has the potential to experience flood inundation during more extreme events. These flood depths and flow velocities, however, are generally less severe under this condition, with very low potential for harm to human life. Continuing with details of the flood fringe area, development is permitted, provided that there are appropriate floodproofing measures incorporated into the design and pending the receipt of a permit from the Conservation Authority. Development of roadway and parking lot grade elevations are to be set no lower than 0.3 meters or 1 foot below the existing condition flood fringe elevation or the engineered inland flood level, whichever governed. Development building openings are to be set no lower than 0.3 meters or 1 foot above the existing condition flood fringe elevation or the engineered inland flood level where governed. So provided in the next few slides are a summary result of the two-zone concept for the Little River watershed. This includes the floodway extents shown in blue and flood fringe extents shown in red. They have been separated into the following sections: the upper reaches, the middle reaches, and the lower reaches. For the upper reaches, as you can see here, the floodway area is contained within the municipal drain banks, and the flood fringe area is spread across primarily agricultural lands. Future development within the red areas would need to abide by IRCA recommended floodproofing levels and stormwater management controls governed by regional SWIM guidelines. Due to the size of the watershed, it was not possible to review each floodline map during this public information session. As I understand, it would be very difficult to also zoom in at this time during the presentations. Stakeholders will get a chance to review the results on an interactive storyboard following this session. For the middle reaches of the watershed, the floodway area is predominantly contained within the municipal drain banks, other than in areas within the Twin Oaks Business Park and Little River Golf Course. The flood fringe area is spread across primarily existing agriculture and some developed lands. As previously stated, the future development within the red areas would need to abide by IRCA recommended floodproofing levels and stormwater management controls. For the lower reaches of the watershed, a more traditional one-zone concept will be accepted where the floodway is contained within the existing City of Windsor dike system. The existing City of Windsor Little River Corridor secondary floodway and weir system to the east of the Little River Drain, shown in light blue, is also expected to be maintained and used as floodway storage during more extreme rainfall and coastal flood events beyond the regulatory level as designed. Which brings us to our next steps. With the Little River Watershed Regulated Floodplain Mapping Study setting the stage for new floodproofing requirements for future development areas within the watershed, the project team will begin finalizing the study to be brought to the IRCA Board of Approval for policy to allow for other ongoing studies to be brought to completion. This includes any master plans, such as the Sandwich South Master Planning area within the upper reaches of the watershed, where there has been coordination on regulated floodproofing requirements necessary to proceed to that design. We now also encourage any stakeholders interested in reviewing how the new regulated floodplain mapping and two-zone concept will affect their property to please log in through the interactive storyboard shown here. For ease of reference, these public information session panels presented to you today, along with the link to the interactive storyboard, have been added to both the City of Windsor Sandwich South Master Plan project website, as well as to the homepage of the IRCA website. So from there, we thank you for your time, and we're now at the point in the session to take any questions or comments in regards to what we have spoken to today.
Thank you very much, Ran. So, like we stressed in the beginning, we do want this session to be very interactive and informative. So please use the raised hand function to ask your questions and comments, and you can also type it in the chat box. And we want to make sure that we are able to answer all your questions and provide answers. Okay. If you would like to ask questions, you could just ask to be on mute, so I could unmute from here. Feel free to unmute. Okay, so there's a question in the chat, and it says, can you provide a link to access more detailed mapping, please?
Yes, so we do have the link and all of the PIC panels provided on the IRCA website. So if you do go to the IRCA website, it's right on the homepage, and you will be able to download all of these PIC panels, as well as the link to the detailed mapping.
Thank you, Ran. So Philippa has a question in the chat box. I'll just read it out. It says, could you please explain why the 100-year flood risk was used as opposed to the Hurricane Hazel standard, and also how the two would be different?
You know what? Maybe I'll jump in on that one, Ryan. Yeah, it's a good question. So back when the authority was actually first formed in the early to mid 70s, Hurricane Hazel was the design standard for floodplain mapping within the area. Actually, the province is separated into a couple zones, 3 zones specifically. We would be zone 1. We would be normally governed by Hurricane Hazel. However, sometime predating my time at the authority, we applied to the minister to get a reduction in standard, which brought us down to the minimum level of protection, which is a 1 in 100-year event, or a 1% chance of occurrence. And in doing so, it enabled a little bit more development across the region, because as everybody who currently resides here, we know it's not enough to say it's relatively flat. We're very, very flat here. And we have soils generally that are really not very good for infiltration. So when you apply Hurricane Hazel to something like this, what you end up is with a vast amount of area that becomes undevelopable. And, you know, that's not really, you know, conducive to the region. That's not conducive to growth. And additionally, you know, we want to proceed in a more economical fashion and allow some of these things to proceed properly, but also meeting some level, at least at a minimum, a 1% chance of flood protection. So in this case, we've always been governed by that since that application went to the minister, which I want to say was sometime in the 1980s, and that's been the standard ever since then.
Thank you, James. So I'm just checking to see if there is any raised hands. If you would like to raise your hand, you could just go to the bottom of your screen and select reactions, and there's the raised hand function there. Okay, so there's another question also from Philippa. It says, as a follow-up to James' reply, is it wise to be building the region's only hospital in a flood fringe using the minimum standard?
From Merca's perspective, I'm not really willing to comment on you know, the ongoing nature of the, you know, the proposed hospital development. So maybe I'm not sure if there's somebody else as part of the team that may want to comment on that, but definitely within the region as a whole, we're applying a minimum standard, and that's applied equally across the entire Essex region. And to be fair, that minimum application or minimum flood standard is also common across other parts within the province as well. So
maybe I can add to a bit to that. So as part of the hospital's approval process, if and when it does move forward, there'll be a number of engineering studies done or be required site specific. And there is, as always, there's a minimum level of standard, whether or not there's a higher standard or some more resiliency that's required, that can be considered at that time.
Thank you, Patrick and James.
I'll just make a note while there's a brief moment there of silence. I did post a link in the chat that was specific to the very first question there. I posted a link to the IRCA website that has a few other links that'll bring you to the slides, as well as the link to the storyboard that Ryan was referring to.
Well, thank you, James.
I think we still have time for a bit more questions. So if you have any question on the presentation or the subject matter, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute or ask your questions in the chat.
I'm sorry to butt in, but I sent a chat question and I don't know if it's been received.
Okay. Did you send it? So I can't see it in the everyone section. Perhaps you sent it to one individual. Would you like to ask or?
Sure. Thank you very much. I tried to send it to the everyone thing, but anyway, the question is, and I have a couple more, but I can wait for later. To what extent were climate change effects accounted for in the hydrologic calculations?
So we did review the Federal Floodplain Mapping Guideline Series in regards to climate change case studies. At this time right now, there is no, I guess, regulated guidelines to assess climate change in regards to floodplain mapping. However, we do appreciate the comment, and we did assess a number of other storm events from the 1 in 200 year event, as well as the Hurricane Hazel. We also looked at the region's, what we call the urban stress test event, which is a more extreme event than the 1 in 100 year. It's actually a 42% increase in volume. And we did look at the effects of those. However, what we found was the depths did not substantially increase. And due to our flat terrain of the region, what we found was it was just a greater spread for the flood fringe level. So overall, what we found is the regulatory 1 in 100 year level would still apply here. But as development proceeds in regards to floodplain proofing requirements, the municipality has any right on a site-specific basis to provide a more enhanced flood proofing level based on the development. So it's kind of an open box right now where we do assess it, but there is no policy right now to really guide us in the direction for climate change.
Well, Ryan, I'll add to it a little bit if that's okay as well. I think one other aspect that we also tried to consider was the potential for changes in the downstream tailwater condition, specifically with the Detroit River and Lake St. Clair. So we looked at what's possible in terms of a potential elevated lake level, and combining that with a specific rainfall event. So that's something that was also looked at through the modeling as well. In terms of policy and guidance from the province, there's some people may be aware that the province released the Ontario Flood Strategy. There was a series of action items to come out of that, and part of that was that the province, through a couple ministries, really assemble a technical task team to specifically address components of floodplain mapping guidance documents. And a lot of the conversation is specific to climate change and how is that best dealt with. A lot of times we're dealing with synthetic rainfall events. How do you best treat that? What's appropriate to combine? Because as you combine, let's say a higher lake level, there's a probability of occurrence there, and then there's a probability of occurrence for a larger or more intense rainfall event. And as you combine those, you're dealing with combined probabilities. So we have to also be careful that we don't start compounding scenarios too much to the point that it becomes over conservative and impractical. For future use. So it's a topic of conversation, but I think with what we've done through this work, I think we've really looked at it as closely as we possibly can. And I think we're a little bit ahead of the game with some of the things that we've looked at for this.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple more questions, but I'll just wait until there's another opportunity. I don't know why my chat thing is not coming through, but I'll just be patient. Thank you.
Thank you. While we wait for others to ask questions, either in the chat, you could ask your questions. So I can really see, okay. William, you have your hands raised. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I didn't figure out how to raise my hand on this Zoom thing. I have not used it very often.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. Obviously, there's a number of questions I do have, but I'd like to kind of make sure there's an understanding that the zoning policy and everything has been constructed and set up jointly with the City of Windsor. And it mainly triggers policy going forward that will have impacts on official plan amendments, reviews, and other development applications down the road. And I guess I want to make sure that there's an understanding in a lot of my questions to date that have been provided to the Sandwich South Master Servicing Plan that have been copied pretty well across the board to council, as well as all the related engineering departments at the City of Windsor, and as well as IRCA and the team from the Upper Little River Stormwater Management team, which I seem to kind of make sure is the policy will follow policy and the rules of the CA role will be of consistency. Am I correct in that understanding across the board?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Mr. Ballas. Yeah, actually, I'll say first, the two-zone policy that's being recommended here. I apologize. I'm at the home office and the phone is ringing, so if anybody can hear that, I apologize. But the two-zone policy has been implemented by the Conservation Authority for many years. So what we're proposing here actually doesn't really result in the changes specifically to the upper reaches. The two-zone policy has always been implemented where watercourses were not modeled. The floodway zone was essentially the bank-to-bank area of a municipal drain, with the flood fringe area being the extension outside of that, 8 meters plus the depth type of scenario. So it is consistent with what has been done. And then in the other areas where Ryan mentioned, where it's more acting more like a one zone policy in the downstream reaches or lower reaches down in the dike portion, it's because the floods are contained within the City of Windsor dike system. So as you mentioned a couple different studies there, in general, the policy that will be implemented, through IRCA and as well as in conjunction with the City of Windsor and how they conduct plan review, it's expected that it will continue in that fashion with the two-zone policy.
Okay, which then leads me to the next question is, in the two-zone policy, if I'm understanding you saying that's always been in effect, am I correct in that, James?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, when you don't have a model watercourse, we've always implemented a two-zone policy, basically for smaller tributaries, et cetera.
Okay. Then obviously, which then leads me to the questions where you have outlined in the Conservation Authority Act that it's very prominent that they will be monitoring and watching, and part of the policy that no dumping or placement and removal of material. In this case, if an individual so wishes to raise their elevations that previously weren't there, that is also problematic. Is that not also an issue? Especially if those lands are located next to the banks of the Little River and also included in the stormwater management corridor. That would be not permitted also. Am I correct in that?
I would say I would avoid the use of problematic, but what I can say is any works that fall under the definition of development that we presented here that is outlined within Section 28 of the Conservation Authorities Act. If it's within the flood fringe area, we operate with a permissive regulation, and a permit may be issued provided that it meets all the necessary criteria.
Okay, but then if it fell within the floodway, that would be not permitted. Am I correct in that?
Hypothetically, and yeah, generally, if something were going into a floodway, generally that would not be permitted. Correct.
Would it also not apply if the lands are within the 325-meter corridor?
The corridor that you may be referring to is specific to a different study, and the corridor width is not necessarily defined by a floodway. So I can't answer that question directly. They're two different things. So if we're talking in a general sense, that may not be a floodway. I can't comment further on that.
And I apologize that I'm going to push the envelope a little bit to say you are part of the Upper Little River. So is the city of Windsor. So is the town of Tecumseh, and so is Stantec. So to say that I can differentiate the floodplain mapping from the Upper Little River puzzles me greatly, because the two of them are coinciding with each other.
So the Upper Little River study was a master drainage study to gather some understanding at a more higher level. This study that we're talking about dives specifically into hydrologic and hydraulic information that is required to do a further delineation and update to the regulatory mapping. So they're not done at the same scale. It's not done at the same level of detail. So they are different, and they were trying to complete different objectives. So for the sake of, I don't know how many, I'm sure you have questions, Mr. Ballas, and I'm obviously willing to talk with you as much as we need to, and including offline. I do want to make sure that other people also have an opportunity to ask questions as well. But I hope that answers your question with respect to those two studies and how they differ.
Yep, and I'll answer some more questions. I'll allow a few more people, because obviously I have more questions. As it all relates in your proposed presentation, that a lot of this is directed to the Sandwich South Master Servicing Plan. So I'll give a few other people an opportunity to ask questions, and I'll come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Does anyone have any other questions?
Hello, I tried again to send a chat thing, but I don't know if it came through.
No, it did not. You could ask your question. Just
okay, thank you. I don't know. I got to figure this out. My next question is: to what extent was all of the recent major urban development in the Walker Road corridor, all that urban development there, well, the pavement, to what extent, and buildings and so forth, to what extent was that accounted for in the hydrologic calculations?
So I can answer that. So through the hydrologic analysis, we actually took into consideration all development within the Walker Road area. What we did was we looked at the, upstream drainage areas going into a number of the municipal drains at a large sub-watershed level. And then through there, we did some model calibration and validation to determine what realistic flows we would actually see during a 100-year event. So kind of to put it in a nutshell, yes, we took into consideration all hard surface within the Walker Road area.
Sort of related to that, if I may, I understand from having attended some other public meetings in the past that there's some kind of stormwater management facilities proposed for that, generally the whole upper reaches, the whole area there, not just Walker Road area, but I mean the entire upper portion of the watershed. Is that accounted for, and is it taken as a given that those will be done, or what exactly, is the role of the stormwater management, stormwater retention, I should say, plans? To what extent are they factored in?
So I think you're speaking in terms of the Sandwich South Master Planning area, which is mainly the large proposed urbanized area in the upper reaches of the Little River watershed.
Correct.
So those developments would require proper stormwater management controls, both for water quality as well as water quantity control. And the allowable release rates would be based on the existing drain capacity of the downstream municipal drain. So wherever it is discharging to, they would have to provide restrictive controls for their water to discharge into the municipal drain to not adversely impact the downstream system. And that is also being considered as part of that Sandwich South Master Plan.
Yes, I thought there was some kind of an overall plan for that area, or plans or something that would rather than sort of piecemeal development by development, I thought there was some kind of an overall strategy.
Yes, there will be a strategy where there are going to be regional stormwater management corridors for large portions of the development.
So that's still definitely part of the picture.
Correct. I think Patrick Winters has his hands up as well.
Sorry, I was stuck on mute there. So maybe just to elaborate a little bit further, basically what will happen is the stormwater management facilities within the upper reaches will basically be required as development proceeds based on the approved land uses coming out of the secondary plans. And as the characteristics of that land changes, to Ryan's point, there will have to be facilities constructed that basically stores the additional runoff.
And is that going to be done by the developers as each sort of sub catchment area is developed, or is it a part of some kind of a municipal strategy or conservation authority strategy or whatever?
So it won't be the same across the entire watershed, because a lot of it will depend on land ownership. So in areas where there's one predominant landowner that comes forward with proposed development, it may be the developer that is physically responsible for constructing the facilities. In other areas where there is fragmented ownership, the city may have to look at it being a city project when it's ultimately implemented. So there's a lot of moving parts to it, but it'll vary depending on where you are in the watershed.
Thank you. Is there a clear plan in place, or is it basically going to be just we're going to wing it? Is there definitely a plan in place that's been maybe adopted by the municipality or the conservation authority, or both?
Yeah, so there's within the two secondary plan areas which are existing, which is the County Road 42 secondary plan area, as well as the East Pelton secondary plan area. There is detailed functional design being done for the swim facilities based on the approved land uses. So within those areas, there are land uses established by the planning policies in place. The other areas, there are assumptions based on what's in the official plan that will be subject to refinement and future detailed design once secondary plans are adopted for the balance of the areas.
Okay, so detailed design will come, but the overall strategy has been adopted?
Correct, but within the two secondary plan areas, the detailed design is being done.
Okay.
Now,
thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. Does anyone else have questions? Please feel free to raise your hands or type in the chat box.
I would just like a clarification. You speak about wetlands and stormwater retention ponds. Am I to understand that this won't be dealt with until the developer comes forward, and then you will tell him that he needs a stormwater retention pond? And how are you going to develop a wetland in the area that exists right now?
Go ahead, Pat, if you go ahead.
well, I don't know if you guys want to step in, but I mean, basically the way it's going to work is you're going to have a series of existing municipal drains, as well as Little River. So the drainage pattern for the overall area is not going to change, but what you're going to do is you're going to introduce secondary facilities adjacent to the existing municipal drains that will provide the necessary detention before basically outletting back into the existing drains at the rate that the lands currently drain into them. So you will have to establish new ponds adjacent to existing drains.
Yeah, well said, Pat. Not much to add there other than, as development proceeds, what we want to try to do is mimic the same form and function of the land in terms of how it drains, so that you don't exacerbate or create any new problems. So as development proceeds, as Pat said, you start creating the necessary stormwater infrastructure so that it closely mimics what's happening today.
And just to add to James and Pat's comments, these stormwater management facilities won't be wetlands per se. They will be traditional stormwater management facilities. So they will be wet ponds.
That's unfortunate because I've seen examples of engineered bathtubs being used as stormwater retention ponds. I'd like to see something more creative. Don't forget that most of these agricultural fields are tiled, and that affects the drainage tremendously. And if you want a wetland, it's not going to happen in a tiled field. So something's got to be done to allow a wetland. Let's face it, most of this watershed would have been marsh originally, and I don't pretend to think that we're going to go back to that, but there needs to be some allowances made. When a developer, my understanding is when a developer puts down his plan, he has to show a stormwater retention pond. But if you're going to build it beside the river, then you really need to make it more than just an engineered bathtub. And wetlands, it's always been a habitat that's been abused in this county. And they've drained them so that they could do other uses with it. So we really need to get a handle on recreating these and allowing, I know people want to get rid of the water on the land as fast as possible, but that's going to have to change. I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Mr. Nesbitt, because I think, I do agree that, to have some sort of a naturalized area within these swim corridors would be important to bring it back to, I guess, even a pre-agriculture level. That is something that the provincial government is looking at in regards to new regional guidelines. And at the time of development, during detailed design of some of these areas, there may potentially be provincial guidance to provide some naturalization area. The one thing we also have to worry about, though, is attracting waterfowl, because there is the Windsor Airport there, right? So any sort of naturalized swim corridor or anything that would be implemented within the Little River watershed would have to provide extensive mitigation measures for any sort of migration of waterfowl.
Thank you, Rand. Patrick, you have your hands raised.
Sorry, I was trying to actually put it down, but just to Mr. Nesbitt's comment, that is something that, and Ryan's comment too, that is something that the city is considering. The idea isn't engineered bathtubs for stormwater, like you see in I guess site-specific issues. The idea is to have a linear corridor or a green space adjacent to the existing drains.
Thank you. Ona, you have your hands up.
Yes, it's funny that I'm labeled as owner. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, thank you. And thank you for your advice about how to raise the hand function.
Glad you
very
figured it out.
Very helpful, thank you. I'd like to echo the comments from Mr. Nesbitt. And I'd like to say that, you know, provincial guidelines, this and that, but the City of Windsor and the Essex Region Conservation Authority have shown, in my opinion, great leadership with stormwater management facilities, which I don't even like that term, such as the Great Blue Heron Lake and many, many others throughout much of the city and even beyond the city regionally, with these more integrated multi-purpose naturalized facilities. I've been very impressed in the past couple of decades with what the city has done and what the Conservation Authority has done in terms of promoting and actually implementing these beautiful facilities that, I don't like the word facilities, these beautiful amenities and features. And even the developers see them now as a sales, you know, they help to sell their developments because it's such a beautiful amenity. So I just hope that that trend continues, particularly in this particular development area in the upper Little River. And I'm optimistic that it will, because of the track record so far in the past 20 years.
Thank you very much for your comments. To those just joining us, we're currently listening to questions and responding to them. So if you joined with your laptop, you have the raised hand function at the bottom of your screen. So you could just click on the reactions tab, and there's a raised hand function, and you can type in the chat. If you're joining us through your phone, go to the menu section, and there's an option of the raised hand and chat box, and feel free to ask your questions. So.
Also, just to add to that, so I'm Ryan Langlois, the water resource engineer on the project. If you do go to the chat, there is a link to detailed mapping for the regulated floodplain mapping update for Little River. If you go to the Essex Region Conservation Authority homepage, there is a link to the public information session panels that we have gone through, just for your information purposes, if you've joined us a little bit late.
Thank you, Ran. So I'm checking the chats right now, and I'm seeing a question from Philippa. It says, could you please explain a little more about the mitigation to prevent waterfowl from being attracted to the water? Is there a ballpark percentage for the incremental costs that will be involved? Right, James?
So I think I can quickly answer that. And the one thing we really have to understand here is this public meeting is directed towards the Little River regulated floodplain mapping update. And although we are encouraging a number of comments and questions in regards to other specific things, we will try to keep it to the Little River floodplain mapping. In regards to mitigation against waterfowl, that's something that would have to be done during more of a detailed design and is currently being reviewed through other master planning studies. So that's something that is being taken care of, but as of right now, there is no specific ballpark percentage for incremental costs that we have on hand right now.
Thank you. Ona, I feel weird calling you Ona. Can you tell me your name? I see your hands up again. Did you raise it again?
I'm sorry. So I have another question. The upper Little River, I guess they call it Sandwich South Lands or something, Sandwich South Planning Area. There is, in the future, there likely to be a lot of development in that area. I think that is the long-term plan, and there's going to be all kinds of different types of development, probably lots of residential, et cetera, in the floodplain areas. When they raise their properties to floodproof, which obviously makes sense, isn't there a possibility that that would raise the floodwaters because the land has all been raised? Has that ever been thought about?
So I'll tackle that one, and Ryan, you can add to it if you feel necessary. But what we're dealing with now is we're trying to figure out what the picture is today, and that's what you're seing in terms of the future development for what will be in the Sandwich Southlands or the upper reaches, whatever you want to call it. That's obviously what's driving all of the work to make sure that we get a clear picture of what's actually out there and happening today, so that when we proceed to further development, that we can do the appropriate studies and analysis to make sure that we don't have an impact on it. So your question is very important, very valid, but we have to know what's going on today to make sure that we don't have a negative impact on that. And that's really what you're seeing here today is what is the existing conditions with respect to the actual Little River watershed and the associated floodplains for the Little River and the associated tributaries.
I understand your answer, but I'm a little confused because, I thought there should be some kind of planning horizon where we worry about changes that might occur and what the effect of those changes might be.
Correct. And those would be done through the additional studies specifically related to the future development. So what you have to do is you always have to start with what's the actual existing condition. And the existing condition today is, what we're providing, which updates the regulatory floodplain mapping. And then as the development proceeds, yes, the landscape changes. And as we're talking about stormwater corridors, whether it's, naturalized, taking in some more natural amenities, whatever the case may be, as you do that development, you try to mimic that condition as best as possible so that you don't have an impact on those flood lines. So specifically, that's the goal, is we don't have a negative impact as you do the new development. And that you're not going to be able to see that today in today's presentation. That's the next step.
So that I understand, and that's crucial then, that the passage of the floodwaters is maintained.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to James' comment there, through a number of master planning studies that are being completed, as well as the Sandwich South Master Plan, we are looking at the impact of initial development areas where we know development is proceeding, and what the impacts are onto these existing condition levels, primarily within the floodway. And the floodproofing requirements, which are dictated by the flood fringe elevations, are also going to have to be adhered to. So what the expectation is during some of these master plans, the downstream impacts of development would be assessed.
But the flood fringe area provides a huge amount of storage of floodwaters. And if that is all raised and developed, then that storage might be affected.
Correct. And that's why typically there's almost a compensation of loss of flood fringe area to adequate stormwater management controls to actually reduce the flow into the downstream system. So all of that is taken into consideration when you're going through these larger master planning studies.
Okay, thank you. I'm optimistic that will be the case. That's often challenging to do that.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I'd like to refer back to an earlier point that was made that the developers will be responsible to put in the stormwater management ponds and facilities, which seems to contradict the current plans that are going in place with the linear elongated ponds that are being proposed currently under the Sandwich South Master Servicing Plan. So am I missing something, or we're not going to have the linear ponds in place anymore based on what was said earlier?
The comment earlier was trying to reiterate who's physically going to be responsible for constructing the ponds. So when you are going to have the linear ponds, but in areas where an entire cell or an entire segment of the linear pond is on lands controlled entirely by one developer, they may be responsible for the initial construction through approvals by the city at the time they go through Planning Act approvals such as draft plan of subdivision.
Okay, so
So you will,
where
sorry,
you
go ahead.
have, in my case, as well as a few other landowners, various ponds have been slated for their properties. Who's building those?
So it's not known at this time. The nature of the response before was meant to be that it's going to depend on where you are in the watershed. So where there's fragmented ownership, such in the case of your lands, we don't know specifically who's going to construct the ponds at this time. It'll depend on the number of property owners in the area, as well as the amount of land needed for the pond. So it's not 100% clear. There'll have to be a phasing strategy developed, and it's a huge study area, and there's multiple cells within the study area.
Okay, I understand that, but in this case, pretty well 80% of my land has been consumed, all right, and set aside for the pond. So, and the fact that you've rolled it into the thing called non-core natural heritage, which then leads to the greenway system. And as I know James had said earlier, all will be defined of what is being presented down the road on the official plan and amendments and developments and lands. In my particular case, and I'm pretty sure there's other landowners that will be impacted to the south of 42, as well as to the north of 42, and are probably of the same concern that I have. Where do we get stuck? Because under the greenway system, you identify lands, all right, as non-core natural heritage / stormwater management under the greenway system, but the greenway system says there's no obligation by the city to buy those lands. So basically, those lands have been restricted from development, all right, whether they are in the fringe or not, okay, and the fact that I've been restricted from developing just like the other landowners, which seems to be a very concerning point, and I'm pretty sure all the other landowners impacted by this similar thing have the same questions in their minds. So
I think we've answered this. Again, to get back to the point, the topic of the meeting tonight is the floodplain mapping. So, I mean, we are talking about that, but we have talked in the past, and the last time, including at the PIC number 2 for the Sandwich South Master Plan, the city only has a couple of tools available to it if it needs to acquire lands. We can either negotiate for lands or we can expropriate lands. So either way, the landowner has to be compensated justly for the land. So if lands are needed for a swim facility, they'll be subject to for future negotiations between the impacted property owners and the city. Is how I would answer that. I can't really answer it any other way.
And Patrick, I appreciate you addressing the question. I want to also just make sure that we don't divert too far away from the topic at hand here, which the topic of stormwater management facilities is not really what we're trying to convey here with everyone. What we're trying to actually get across is what the existing conditions are specifically for the floodplain area and that evaluation. So future stormwater management corridors that may be defined through the Sandwich South Master Servicing Study, which this is a component of that. I understand that, but we have to make sure that we stay on track and keep focused on the floodplain mapping and the hazard component of this. And Mr. Ballas and anybody else listening and watching, we're obviously happy to talk further about your specific property, your specific needs. Whether it's property negotiations, getting a better understanding of how this information impacts your property and how some of the other studies impact your property. We can certainly do that, but I would recommend that we do that offline so that we can really give it the attention that it deserves. It's your property, and we want to make sure that we're focused on your property through that type of a scenario.
And I appreciate your reply, but I think it's also important as a public notification to the landowners that are impacted, all right, are also aware of all the impacts down the road. You've indicated that this particular PIC meeting is related to the floodplain mapping. I acknowledge that. And you've indicated that it's a key component going forward that impacts everything in the storm sandwich self master servicing plan, which is also very important. But that doesn't mean we cannot discuss or extend the extensions. That was my point in raising it. The other thing I'd like to make sure that I understand is that you've indicated both the city has applied and Dylan as well as IRCA, that if you go to your specific things, the maps that were presented in the presentation will have a more extensive detailed mapping provided with a ledger and a full mapping. Am I correct in that, James?
What's there is a storyboard to allow you to zoom into your specific property to see the effects of the floodplain, both floodway and flood fringe. So you can type in your address and you can find your specific property and see what the impacts are. So that's what's been included there. So if you go to the slide, specifically slide 21, has the link as well as the login and the password associated with that.
Okay, I understand that, but I guess what I want to be able to say is when I referred to the comment of being consistency, we should be able to have a updated map, as I think I sent out earlier today, that gives you the full picture from the very beginning of the Detroit River all the way to Highway number 3.
This will do that. This will do that, Mr. Ballas. This will give you the full picture for the entire area. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. But I want you to understand it is there. The storyboard is there, and you can gain a full picture for the entire watershed, whether it's your specific property, or you can also zoom out and see the larger picture. So that is there.
I guess, Mr. Ballas, just to kind of add to that, sorry, James, but the map that you did send out earlier today obviously represented some flood inundation along the coastline. Please understand that flood map is more to the Detroit River and Lake St. Clair and not the actual Little River watershed. So what we did was, I think James talked about the probability of extreme rainfall events of high water levels acting on at the same time as a large rainfall event. We actually took the average annual max monthly mean of the water levels in the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair as our boundary condition, not the 1 in 100 year or max extreme water level in the Detroit River. So the flooding that you see there is not actually related to any riverine flooding due to the Little River watershed. That's more a coastal flooding issue.
I think I'm referring to the existing conditions of the Little River floodplain mapping is the one I sent out today, which shows the existing 100-year floodplain, the Little River watershed, and lands currently identified to be protected by the barrier lands. Am I not correct in that? And that's the one that was done by Dylan. Isn't that not what everyone received? Which was one that was inputted in your original PIC 2 mapping?
So unfortunately, Mr. Ballas, I don't have the PIC 2 mapping right here, and I don't have that image that you sent available to me right now. But as you can see right now, if you go onto the storyboard, that is the updated Little River floodplain mapping. To the lower portions of the watershed, the high water levels would be dictated more on a coastal flooding assessment or the elevations based on a inland engineered study as stated in one of our PIC panels here.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much, Mr. William. I see that, Una, your hands are up again. Is it from the previous question or you have a new question? And are there others who would like to ask questions? You can type in the chat or you can unmute.
I'm sorry, am I waiting or am I being invited?
Oh, you're being invited.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead and
Just as a point of clarification, it seems to me that all of these floodplain areas, or 90% of them, it's a simple flood fringe where people if they want to develop something, they just have to raise it high enough, just maybe a couple of feet or something, or half a meter, whatever, pardon my lack of metric, so that it's not going to flood. So I don't see that there's a major restriction. I think it just makes a lot of sense. And so I think the floodway, which is the prohibitive area, is in almost all cases limited to a very narrow, tiny corridor. And so to me, the whole thing makes sense. If you want to build subdivisions or whatever else in the floodplain area, just raise it up a little bit. So that's just a comment.
And I do appreciate that comment. And I think one thing we have to understand is, yes, development will be able to proceed within the flood fringe area. However, there will be significant conditions, like not just raising your property grades, but also abiding by the regional stormwater management requirements, where you need to provide both water quantity and water quality control to restrict flows into that downstream water course. So there is no adverse impacts to the downstream system.
Which of course is crucial.
Correct.
Thank you.
That's both a regional as well as a provincial guideline.
Everything makes sense to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand to ask more questions, or you could just unmute yourself and speak.
See, there's a couple new people joining as well, connecting into the audio. Maybe give them a chance as well.
Yeah, so anyone that is just joining us, we have, finalized with our, formal presentation. If you do go on to the Essex Region Conservation Authority website, you will be able to gain access to the official slides that were presented today. There will also be a link on the very last or second last slide, which will take you to an interactive storyboard where you'll be able to review the updated regional floodplain maps for the Little River watershed.
And because there's obviously a cross connection, as we've all talked about today. If there's any specific information related to the Sandwich South Master Servicing Study, I believe the City of Windsor is hosting a web page that has all the relevant information related to that, including the past PICs and any relevant information there. So you can find that information there, as well as this slide deck should be on that web page as well, I believe, right, Patrick?
Correct, and the website is www.sandwichsouth.ca.
Thank you. And also a reminder to those just joining us, if you would like to ask questions, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen at the center view. And you can also select the reactions tab to use the raised hand function and unmute yourself to ask the questions. We still have time for more questions, so please ask away. Be happy to answer your questions.
So yes, Mr. Hanna, I do see your question. This is being recorded.
Ryan, could you perhaps maybe just give a high level as to where the mapping is, et cetera? Mr. Hanna is asking for just a high level summary.
Yeah, so can everybody still see my screen? Excellent. So, Mr. Hanna, we have gone through, obviously, the regulated floodplain mapping process. What we have identified is we are, recommending to bring to policy a two-zone concept, which is going to consider both a primary floodway and a secondary flood fringe area. The primary floodway is predominantly governed within the banks of the respective municipal drains, and that's what you see in blue here. And the secondary flood fringe area is what you see in red, which is primarily spread across, majority of agricultural lands in the upper regions and some existing developed lands in the lower and middle reaches. For the most part, the floodproofing requirements will be dictated by the flood fringe area elevations for any future development. And we separated here just at a very high level to go through both the upper reaches of the Little River watershed, which is what you see here, the middle reaches of the watershed, where once again you can see in red the flood fringe area, and in blue the primary floodway area, as well as the lower reaches of the Little River watershed, which the floodway is primarily contained within the existing City of Windsor dike system. And then also showing the City Little River corridor secondary floodway and weir system, which was engineered and designed for flood fringe area inundation during more extreme rainfall events. And that is an existing condition. So this here is the second last slide of the presentation, which you can find on the detailed mapping link that I've provided, as well as the link that Patrick Winters provided. And if you click on this link here, where it opens up in a new window, you can put in this username and password, and you can zoom in on your specific property or any property you see fit to look at how the two-zone concept would impact any property within the study area. So you're encouraged, and almost all stakeholders are encouraged to go to the detailed mapping and can be reviewed on their own time. And if there is any questions or comments, you could reach out to either myself or James Bryant.
Thank you, Ren.
So I do think, Mr. Ballas, you do have a question?
Yeah, I'm just double checking those last two profiles. I think they're pages 20 and 21. Obviously, the last one, the lower reaches, as well as the last one where you indicate those are new mappings. That was not what was on the website for the Sandwich South secondary plan attachment. Am I correct in that, or?
So we did update the slides this morning to show the link to the interactive storyboard. So we wanted to provide that the day of. So then after this presentation, once we provided context to the study, the stakeholders could go back and look at the storyboard. Just looking at the storyboard and not having this conversation, it would have been difficult to follow. And then we did add the limits of the corridor secondary floodway, which was designed by the City of Windsor a number of years back. So that was the last addition prior to this meeting.
Yeah, and the content there that's been added is more so just to add, some additional clarity. It doesn't change any of the other information.
No, I'm just double checking.
Has no impact with respect to the actual hydrologic and hydraulic modeling that was completed.
Correct.
Right, but I just wanted to confirm that they were updated. That's all. So they will be updated on the IRCA website, as well as on the Sandwich South Master Servicing Plan?
Yeah, they are currently updated on the IRCA website. As we speak, it's already there.
Okay, good. And then the other thing is the defining of the next step, which was the next page. that's been revised and changed too. So I just wanted to confirm, that's all. I just wanted to make sure what I had in front of me and what I'm seeing is not the same. So I just wanted to make sure I follow up with it. The full mappings that we've been provided does have the elevations on those mappings. Am I correct in that?
Correct. If you go to the storyboard and you start zooming in on each of the watershed reaches, you'll notice there will be a yellow junction or dot in the center of the drain. And if you click on that, it will give you the flood fringe elevation based on the new updated regulated floodplain mapping.
Okay, thank you on that point.
Thank you, William. So we have a question in the chat box from David, and it says, how will the huge WRH mega hospital parking lot and flat roof space affect stormwater flooding? What is the WRH site specific plan exactly for mitigating this excessive hardscape?
So I can attempt to answer that. So we alluded to it a bit before. I think Mr. Hanna was able to join the meeting on another question that popped up regarding the hospital. If and when the hospital moves forward, they will be required to do a series of engineering studies that are site specific. And a standard requirement of any development is that they have to provide a stormwater management plan for approval by the municipality that will show how they're going to store their own water on site. And since they're located within the flood fringe, they will also need a permit from ERCA.
Thank you, Patrick. Go ahead, Mr. Williams.
Yes, you just indicated that when the hospital proceeds, that they will have to be permitting updates and applications and outlining their stormwater management. If any abutting property, since I'm 150 meters east of them, will I be included in that release of information? So I have be able to make comment on that?
So notifications will probably be given out in accordance with the Planning Act. So depending on the nature of the application that is made by the hospital, notifications will be given out as required by that.
The only concern I have, is there not a distance restriction on that, Patrick?
For notification, there is. I don't know the specifics. I know that there are notification requirements mandated by the Planning Act. So planning will follow those when applications are brought forward.
My next question is when we talk about the overall Little River, I just want to kind of make sure, since the mapping does show that the town of Tecumseh is involved in the back of this, are they involved in any of this, or is there any communications? Or James, did any requirements need them to be involved in? Just curious as to where they stand, because some of the drainage rivers that do fall into the Little River obviously start and generate from the town of Tecumseh. So I was just curious, where do they play in this overall new Little River mapping?
Yeah, thanks. I believe I addressed that through the email that I had replied to, I think today, which basically outlined the fact that yes, the town of Tecumseh is a stakeholder. They are a contributor to the overall watershed, and they have been engaged through various components of this study. Even from the right from the outset from the start of the project, as well as through coordination of various other studies that are happening just outside of the city of Windsor boundaries. But we know that water comes in. We've had conversations, and Dillon Consulting in the city of Windsor has had conversations with them about specifically the stormwater management and how that affects this work here. So yes, they are engaged. And they are aware.
So is there anything in your review and calculations of the requirements with outlining the new flood mapping plane, as well as the adjustments to the floodway or the 100-year one plan and the fringes? So that has been brought into the calculation, I guess, is my question.
I'm sorry, can you, oh, Ryan, if I was going to say, can you repeat that question for me? But if you got it, Ryan, take her away.
Yeah, Mr. Bell. So all of the runoff and hydrology that is from the Old Castle area from the town of Tecumseh has been taken into consideration to contribute to this overall watershed scale holistic model. So yes, all of their watershed has been accounted for as part of the study.
And that includes the lands to the east of the city property line. Am I correct in that too?
Correct. That includes any areas, I guess it would be the northeast, which we could call the hamlet lands. So yes, that has been accounted for.
One of the other things I'd like to bring up too is it seems as many of the discussions when it's raised as it comes to the question of the Windsor Airport property, there seems to be a lack of information being generated as to what will they be required to do as well as the rest of us, and how they are also being measured in this overall Little River plan. So has that all been calculated, or?
So yes, similar to the town of Tecumseh, the city of, well, I guess City of Windsor's Windsor Airport, their hydrology has also been contributed. So any areas within the Little River watershed have been considered to contribute to the overall Little River. In regards to anything in the future, that is to be done under subsequent studies, such as the Sandwich South Master Plan, and was further discussed through those public meetings.
Okay.
Ryan, do you want to flip to the slide that is, what is the purpose of this study? Very early on in the presentation. There we go. Yep, that one there. Okay, so the red boundary is the watershed boundary. So all the lands within the red line is what is contributing to this watershed. And you can see there's a black line that's the city and town boundary between the city of Windsor and the town of Tecumseh. So you can see the red line extends and crosses that line because, as we all know, water does not follow municipal boundaries. So we have to look at this as a whole watershed, and that's what has been done. So you can see the airport lands, and you can see the town of Tecumseh lands, and all that has been accounted for with respect to the modeling update here.
Yeah, okay, I see that. And the point, I guess, as you just pull out there, you've got the 1985 mapping that also identifies in the McLaren mappings. So is this new map sort of we'll call a uptick or revision to the McLaren 1985 mapping, James? That's
correct. So we're updating the regulatory flood maps. What the 1985 mapping did not do, they did not map all of the tributaries. So the mapping was actually specific to the Little River itself. So what we've done is actually looked at the entire watershed to get an idea of what the hydraulic grade lines are throughout all of the tributaries. That way we have a better understanding of how to handle this information and how to move forward with it. So we're in a position now much better than we were in 1985. This type of study to be done in 1985 with the current tools would be extremely difficult, cumbersome, and if it were to be capable of being done, it would be very, very expensive. So we're just in a better position now with the tools that we have to basically expand on that, use what we have in front of us, what's available, and that leads to some updated regulatory floodline maps.
And I'm just going to refer back to the 1985 flood mapping. They call out referencing, and maybe you can help, they define the word flood line. Is flood line and flood fringe the same, or are we talking two different words?
I don't have the report in front of me, but generally the flood line is basically the full extent of the floodplain. So if we're looking at where the full extension of the floodplain is, generally in the 1985, that would be flood line. If that's what you're referring to. Again, yes. I don't have it in front of me. But there will be differences. There will be differences because we're modeling everything.
Oh, I understand there will be differences. That part I can, understand. I just wanted to make sure the distinction between the flood line and the flood fringe and the floodway, which at the end of the day, they are all a floodplain. The only difference now is we're going to a two-zone system that one identifies the floodway, and then the flood fringe is the outer extension to the point of the flood line. If I'm saying
the overall flood hazard limit, I guess we want to call it. So the overall, the combination of the two zones is the flood hazard limit, and then they're distinguished into two separate sections.
Yeah, so there will be a major difference between the old mapping to current, because now we have the capabilities of actually defining a little bit better what the floodway zone is and what the flood fringe zone is. So that's a fundamental difference. And it sounds like, Mr. Ballas, that you got it pretty well understood. So I'm happy to hear that.
That part I understand. What I wanted to kind of lead to the next thing is the 95 or 1985 mapping was utilized to define and identify my lands as well as a few other lands as to being a major flood hazard, and therefore identified as non-core natural heritage, which is my big stumbling block. Identifying your lands as a non-core natural heritage is one thing. Identifying your lands that are required for the use of a stormwater management corridor, all right, and not being permitted to develop your lands, and then saying, well, we're going to put wet ponds in those areas. Then we talk about the point that was raised earlier that we have to watch the waterfowl, which then falls into play. Well, if I'm 40 meters across from the airport, and I know there's other lands that will be either closer or also a little bit further, are all in the vicinity of the airport of the waterfowl, okay? Which puzzles me as to why we're not utilizing some lands on the airport property to support the flood stormwater management system and trying to utilize a lot of the private lands.
So, Mr. Ballas, sorry, you can go.
Sorry, Ryan. Yeah, I'll take this one, and again, I'll reiterate the fact that what we're dealing with is identifying what the existing conditions are. It's less about what the airport lands may or may not be capable of doing with respect to additional and future development. So again, here, what we're presenting is the floodplain extends as it exists today.
Yeah. And just to add to Mr. Bryant's, I guess, statement, Mr. Hanna does have some questions, and we are, getting close to last 20 minutes of the PIC. So we would like to focus on specifically related questions to the regulated floodplain mapping update. So, Mr. Ballas, we do appreciate, obviously, a number of your questions. We have heard them in the other PICs for the Sandwich South Master Plan, and we can speak offline to any other comments or concerns you may have.
Thank you, Ryan. So to read out Mr. David's question, he says, has ARCA received any new pressure to lessen environmental and climate change mitigation standards for the Sandwich South Master Plan and WRH sites, given changes to the recent Provincial Conservation Act by the province and the municipal and provincial pushes to cut so-called development red tape? Could you elaborate? And then the other question is, then the Little River wastewater treatment plant is in the main floodplain itself. How is it being protected specifically? I think we can just take one question and then followed by the other, and then the last.
Yeah, thanks, Faith. I'll address the first question there with respect to the changes to the Conservation Authorities Act. I'm just kind of rereading it quickly here. Have we received any pressures to lessen environmental and climate change mitigation standards? No, we've not been pressured to reduce any standards. I would actually say that the changes to the Conservation Authority Act really provides clarity around the natural hazards component of a conservation authority's job. And it's very clear that the natural hazards component, it is our responsibility to deal with that, which is kind of what we're doing here is we're updating our floodplain mapping to figure out what the actual natural hazard is with respect to the rainfall events. Getting an understanding of what the 1% chance occurrence is, figure out what the floodway extents are and what the flood fringe extents are. So I can't really comment with respect to a hospital or anything in that regard. But we're aware of the changes to the Conservation Authorities Act, and we're pivoting as necessary to align our budgets and align our scope of services and programs and services and how we deliver them to make sure that they're in line with the provincial legislation as it stands today.
Thank you, James. And then the second question, Rand.
Yeah, so I can probably take that one. So the Little River wastewater treatment plant, it's not actually in the main floodplain area. It is outside of the existing Little River dike system. Based on our modeling analysis, the primary floodway is still being maintained within the dikes. However, back in 1985, there was a engineered design secondary floodway system around the Little River Pollution Control Plant to the north of Little River. And although that area cannot actually be fully utilized for any sort of like extreme rainfall flooding event to be used for floodplain attenuation, the green space within the Little River corridor can. So these are just approximate limits of the corridor secondary floodway and weir system. However, we're showing that those would not be inundated under our new updated mapping. The wastewater treatment plant is also much higher during largest or statically under those events.
Thank you, Rand. So we'll take the third question on green infrastructure, and then after that,
sorry, I want to break in. This is Anna Godo from engineering. The Little River Pollution Control Plant is protected by barrier landform, so it's outside of the flood area. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Appreciate it.
Okay, and the third question says, what will be the level of green infrastructure? What will be the level of green infrastructure in climate mitigation in the Sandwich South and Little River plans?
So I think, Mr. Hanna, that's obviously something that we have had ongoing discussions with as part of the Sandwich South Master Planning PICs, and they have been looked at in regards to mitigation on a development level. Green infrastructure obviously being a very good thing for a number of regions across the globe and even across Ontario. But due to our clay soils, we've seen that there isn't a huge impact of putting in green infrastructure such as low impact development techniques to actually compensate for larger storm events such as a 1 in 100 year. Green infrastructure in our region is primarily focused on providing water quality and what's called that first flush, which would be the first 32 mils of any storm event. And green infrastructure can provide really good controls when it comes to those smaller storm events. Once you get into larger storm events, unfortunately, the green infrastructure doesn't work due to our clay hard soils that we have. Very limited void space for infiltration.
Thank you, Anne. Seems we still have a few more minutes for questions before we wrap up the session today. Please type in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to comment or ask questions. Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Faith. I was just going to reiterate the fact that we do have some information posted within the chat. Specifically, it can also be found on slide 21, which includes the login information to get in and take a look at your map look at your property through the storyboard that's provided there. There's login information, including a username and a password. So feel free to do that. We encourage you to do that. And then if you have specific questions related to your property, they can be directed to one or both of the two individuals listed on the last slide. So just in case anyone was joining us late. I don't think that's the case, but I still see someone connecting to audio. That may just be on my computer though.
Thank you, James.
Okay, so I think with that, if there's no other questions, we once again try to, encourage all stakeholders and residents to please visit the interactive storyboard. And like James mentioned, if there is any questions or you would like any other specific inquiries, you could reach out. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for your time.
Thanks, guys. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, I just want to extend a thank you as well to everybody. So appreciate those who hopped on. Very much appreciate the conversation and comments. So we're looking forward to finishing up this study. So appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to thank everyone that is involved. It was very great to have everyone. And hopefully when we do have that next meeting under the Sandwich South Master Servicing Plan as a stakeholder individually, hopefully, James, you can partake in that meeting also, because a lot of questions have been directed to IRCA in those meetings that we've set up.
Certainly, if I'm available, and it gets coordinated, I assume that'll get coordinated through the City of Windsor. And I'll be available, as I said before, happy to answer your questions, Mr. Bell. So I appreciate your thanks with respect to this presentation as well.
Thank you, everyone. James, do we have time for one more question, or it can be answered offline?
If there's one more question, we're here. Yes, certainly.
Okay.
Let's take it, and I think that'll probably be it for the evening.
Yeah. So it's David's question. It said you're stating that GI could be overwhelmed in significant rain events. However, the cause would be excessive hardscape and development as farmland not overwhelmed per se now. I'm not sure, David, if that's a question or a comment. Would you like to clarify by unmuting? Okay.
Mr. Hanna, if you're there and you can speak, we're looking for a little bit of clarification to the question you put in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if not, perhaps he doesn't have the capability there to unmute. I'm not sure, but we can take the question, and perhaps Mr. Hanna, if you can hear us, maybe pose the question via email. You can address it to myself and Ryan. The contact information is there, and if you want to phrase that question, we'll be happy to answer it.
Yeah, and Mr. Hanna, if I kind of understand correctly, you did identify in regards to new development standards, the provincial government is looking at implementation of LID techniques at a minimum level, and that would be potentially a requirement in the future. At this point in time, that is not a provincial guideline or a local guideline, but there is things in the works that would potentially, change things on a lot level in regards to green infrastructure. So that would obviously enhance the amount of green space that you're kind of, elaborating to here, and it would be minimizing some hardscape.
Okay. With that, yeah, do we want to? Oh, Mr. Ballas, sure. We got. This will be
Just a quick question.
The last one. Sure.
The recording of this will be available for access?
We'll look into that to see what we can do. Certainly the presentation is available, at least at the moment. And if you have specific questions for us related to the content or anything else that you might have, you can direct it to us.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate everybody's time on this, and I think we're looking to wrap this up.
Everybody have a good rest of the night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Night, everyone.